Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I want to respond to a video Brian at the channel Bookish put up about writing. He himself was responding to another video, an interview with the author Neil Gaiman talking about his writing process. Gaiman is a novelist, which is a kind of writing I just cannot imagine ever trying to do in any significant way. Like Brian, I'm a nonfiction writer. I published a couple of academic history books, and right now I'm returning to work on a memoir, so I thought I would throw in my own thoughts and practices related to writing. The first thing Brian mentions is the issue of handwriting versus typing the very first draft of a piece of writing. Both he and Neil Gaiman choose to get started with paper and pen. In explaining his choice, Brian says in his video that, quote, I can just write. Personally, I find this quote of his absolutely fascinating. For me, exactly the opposite feels true. When I'm writing, I often feel quite distanced from what I'm writing, separated from it by the concentration it takes me to actually form the words in handwriting on a page. Instead of just thinking about the words, I'm hyper aware of the physical construction rather than the ideas. That is, what the words look like on the page as I try to make it legible rather than what it is I want to say. Instead, I type. I type fairly well and fairly quickly, so it seems like an invisible process to me. Also, when I'm typing, I make sure the document is set to Times New Roman or some other plain but serif-based font. That way, what I'm writing fundamentally looks like a book. Perhaps that's the opposite of what both Neil and Brian are trying to do. I understand the desire to perhaps lower the stress or reduce the sense that what you're doing is going to be judged by other people. But fundamentally, perhaps because I've always written my first drafts in type, I know that no one is going to judge these drafts until I choose to share them. Instead, when my typed words look something like a book, I think it helps me put my words together in a somewhat more formal way, appropriate to academic prose, for sure. Now that I think about it, I wonder if writing a draft by hand might encourage me to write in a more personal way, a way that might be more appropriate for memoir writing. I'll have to think about that. And of course, both Brian and Neil transfer their writing to computer files for the editing process. I do a lot of editing after I have a complete draft, but I also do a lot of editing on the fly, reconstructing particular sentences or even pulling paragraphs from pages earlier to where I currently am writing in the very moment. I feel like when I'm writing, I'm utterly sucked into whatever I'm doing, and I have more access to a vision of the work as a whole than I do if I'm looking at it on an individual piece of notebook paper. I say utterly sucked in, and I mean it. Was he a psychologist, Csikszentmihalyi, who talked about the flow state, where we lose consciousness of our mundane lives and get absorbed by whatever we're doing? That routinely happens to me when I'm reading a good book and when I'm writing, even when I'm writing what is still a really bad book. That certainly happened to my father, too, a writer whose dissertations and essays and first books were all written on a manual typewriter. He would emerge from his study looking slightly confused at the time of day, having forgotten to eat often. I definitely am following in his footsteps. The first time I really became aware that I had been in a flow state while writing was when I had first tried writing poetry on my computer, something I found just unbelievably freeing. I was taking a poetry class with the amazing Seamus Heaney, wildly. Apparently, I was selected for the tiny class because I had something of a reputation on campus as an editor of other people's poetry. But I certainly wasn't a poet. A couple of the actual poets in the class jotted down first drafts of poems in their beautiful moleskin notebooks. They would edit them a bit before turning them in at the end of the week, but basically the poems were gorgeous from the beginning. I, on the other hand, wrote and erased and wrote again and crossed out every word, etc. It was like pulling teeth, and it was really discouraging. As soon as I sat down at my computer, there was this permission to jot down any terrible thing, because it was super easy just to make it disappear whenever I wanted. I wasn't marring any beautiful notebook or even getting stuck looking at all the things I'd had to cross out, feeling gloomy about how poor a poet I was. But that fresh page on the computer, it stayed as clean and perfect as I wanted it to. I had a separate file open to keep my discards, and I sometimes mined it and found things worth keeping in it. I spent 4 hours or so working on my assignment for the week, and when I finished, I realized that it was already dark outside, even though I had been utterly unaware of the passage of time. Actually, entering the flow state while typing on a computer might be quite hard for a lot of people. One reason it's possible for me is because I type much faster than I can handwrite, and I don't think that's true for everyone. Computers can be full of rabbit holes that suck up our time, too, and take people away from the work they actually want to be doing. But writing on a computer works for me, perhaps because I started writing by using a typewriter, then switched just a few years later to a computer before there was really an internet to distract me. I think my computer probably had a digital version of Solitaire or something like that on it, but it was not nearly exciting enough or addictive enough to distract me. Of course, my current laptop has a ton of stuff on it to distract me now, but I've made a decision to do most of those time-wasting, distraction-oriented things on my phone exclusively, and not on my laptop. That way, when I'm in the middle of a writing project, I don't tend to think about checking Instagram or what used to be Twitter or whatever, unless my phone is right next to me. And as you might guess, I make a point of not putting my phone within easy reach, unless there's a particular reason why I need to, which there certainly was for a lot of the last couple of years while my partner was sick. Things happen in our lives sometimes that might disrupt our writing practices, and that's simply the way it has to go. I am so committed to composing prose while typing that even when I'm making diary or journal entries, I type them. For years, I've mostly just used my usual word processing program. I create a new document for each month where I make daily entries in chronological order. I then file the month's document in a folder for the particular year, and all the years in a folder called something like journal. At some point, I tried a free online platform, Pinzu, and there are many other similar platforms, which worked fine too, and it really might be preferable for you if you like to write on different devices at different times, like sometimes on your phone and sometimes on your laptop or whatever. Personally, I'm happiest with my old system. To be clear here, I keep saying type, but when I say I typed something, I mean I typed it on a computer, not on a typewriter. Getting yourself to sit down and get started with those first words might seem less intimidating for some people on a manual typewriter or on a pad of paper, but the editing process is such an important part of writing, and it's a part that is made thousands of times easier by word processing. If you're just sketching something down for yourself, editing doesn't matter so much. But even if you're trying to write down memories for your grandkids to read years from now, you're almost certainly going to want to make your writing more accessible, clearer, perhaps more detailed. You'll want to elaborate or correct something after you think about it more. And if you're writing for publication, you'll definitely want to edit. Brian and Neil both are actually starting that editing process as they move from the handwritten draft to their typewritten draft. It isn't, of course, just a process of straight transcription, but a time to make a first pass, as a lot of writers and editors would say. Since I'm starting with that typewritten first draft, it isn't as easy for me to say exactly what is first draft and what has already gone through some of the earliest stages of editing. I'm really curious if it might change what gets produced. I don't know. To go back to typewriters for a second, I will mention what I think is one of the most beautiful uses of a manual typewriter that I've heard about from one of my pretend friends on the internet. Old typewriters are really beautiful objects to a lot of us, and they're certainly romantic and romanticized. Taking advantage of both facts, this friend and his partner put a lovely old manual typewriter on the side table in their entry hall, and the two partners write notes to each other when they come and go. Notes about when they'll be home, what they might have for dinner, any little quotidian thing that shows their love for each other. Just wonderful. So that is my long discussion about handwriting drafts versus typing. I do want to mention another way of producing a book, though, that's neither handwriting nor typing, and that is speaking. Many of you know that the only way I personally can speak aloud and make any sense is for me to have spent some time typing out some thoughts beforehand. I don't even have to have them in front of me later, but sketching out what I want to say in print makes me think of ideas in a way I usually can't if I'm truly talking only off the cuff. My husband, on the other hand, needed to talk everything out before he wrote, just to know what he was thinking. He loved to do that talking with me or with his colleagues, especially his friend Tess, who also thinks while talking. But when necessary, he would just talk aloud to himself, whenever and wherever he was trying to write something. He did that for all the years I knew him. And then, for the last months of his life, when he could neither handwrite nor type, he spoke to his phone, sometimes using the digital transcriber, but sometimes just recording stories he hoped that I would transcribe later on. It's a gift to have those recordings. Well, let's go on. The other big issue Brian takes up is the idea of rituals that get us to sit down and actually start writing. He talks about the idea of going to write full-time in a hotel room. Last year, I posted about how David and I used a few days stuck together in a hospital room to work in the same way. Technically, it worked, but there are nicer writing residencies where authors can devote full days to their craft. I don't have a lot to say about writing routines, but I really loved the comment that Gaiman said, and Brian reiterated, that instead of getting absolutely wedded to one plan, we should be flexible. They both talked about how their initial instincts were to write late at night, which they did when they were younger, but as they got older, they started writing earlier in the day. I've gone back and forth. When I was writing my master's thesis and my PhD dissertation, I wrote exclusively in the mornings, from around 7 a.m. until 1 p.m. or so. And then I had a kid, and I found myself writing only at night and during parts of the weekend when David was home from work and taking on all the childcare duties to give me time to write. Then several years later, when Abe was more independent, I spent my mornings homeschooling with him, but often did my own writing in the afternoons when he had assorted activities or was working independently on his own. For that last year or two, when David and I were working on our memoir, we wrote together whenever we had energy, and it completely varied depending on the day. And now I am yet again in a new situation, and I don't know for certain yet which rituals will take hold. If I had to guess, I would say mornings are the most likely choice, but we'll see. What I really love about what Brian and Neil say is that we should accept what our needs and abilities lead us to. Thank you, Brian, for raising these really interesting issues, and I'd love to hear how all of you would answer these questions. If you have thoughts, consider this discussion a tag video, and consider yourself tagged. I'll name a couple of people I think might have something to say. Katie at Books and Things, Margaret Pinard, Charles Heathcote, Steve Donahue. What do you think? Well, thank you so much for joining me today on this discussion video here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.